Welcome back to Indiana at the voice of college football. Appreciate everybody for being here tonight. We got a great show on tap as we got to talk about the bye week for Indiana football. And they got a massive game coming up against the Ohio State Buckeyes, but they just had a massive game against the Michigan Wolverines. And this game was so important for Indiana because even though Michigan coming into this game is only 5-4. Indiana was favored by 14. The perceived perception of this game and the fact that the Michigan Wolverines have dominated Indiana for the last 40 years outside of one win for Indiana during the pandemic year. This was still going to be a huge hurdle for Indiana to cross. And it looked like it was going to be really easy for Indiana at first. But then, after a 17-3 lead over Michigan at half, it all crumbled. It all fell apart for Indiana. And it looked like the same old Indiana was going to happen yet again. They were going to blow a lead. Now, even if Indiana did lose this game, it's not the same old Indiana. This is a significantly different team, a significantly better team than Indiana has had in such a long time. Because the 2020 season and the 2019 season were both great years for Indiana. But the thing is with those seasons is that you could tell that there were parts of the team that weren't that great. Like you had Michael Penix, Peyton Ramsey was a solid backup, you had Stevie Scott, you had a couple good receivers, and you had a couple good defenders like Micah McFadden. But overall, there were still some key parts to the team that weren't that great. And unfortunately, that's what really hampered them from being able to continue to have great teams moving beyond those two seasons. That's why Michael Penix, never stayed healthy. He never stayed upright because of the fact Indiana's offensive line was abysmal back in those two seasons. And Penix was just so good at being able to throw under pressure that it didn't matter for the most part until, unfortunately, he got injured. But the thing is that Indiana football this year has a complete team. They've got way better offensive linemen than they've had for so long. They got good receivers, good running backs, a great quarterback that's in the Heisman conversation. Even though he did make a mistake against Michigan, he threw a bad pick, but still made some big timely plays for Indiana, especially that pass to Keyshawn Williams late in the game that helped seal the victory. And then their defense is really good as well. And their special teams, Indiana special teams, outside of one bad punt, was good all game. They hit two key field goals in this game. Had a really big punt return from Keyshawn Williams, which is huge because he's not even the main return guy. Miles Price is normally the return guy for Indiana. But Keyshawn Williams was a big factor in the game. Had a lot of big receptions for Indiana in the Michigan game, but also had that big key return that helped kind of turn the tide back in Indiana's favor, get the crowd back into it once things were looking a little bit dim and rough for Indiana. This was such a marquee win for IU because of the fact, just the perceived perception about how good of a program Michigan is compared to Indiana. Even a lot of Michigan fans were like, we can beat IU. Coming into this game, a lot of them said we can win. And Indiana was able to somehow be able to, but despite the perceived perception, get the win. I think that's what's so key for Indiana football is that even though they almost let Michigan get the win. They almost, unfortunately, let this perfect season bite the dust. They didn't at the end of the day. They still were able to hold on and be able to grind out a victory, something they have not had to do all season up to this point. I mean, they've been blowing people out. I mean, that's what the commentators said tons of times in this game. Gary Danielson and Brad Nessler were like, hey, Indiana, they're used to blowing people out. They're not used to these close games this year. Well, even though they might not be, used to these type of close games, they might not be used to nail biters, they still were able to win. I think that definitely shows the ability of this team that in no matter what scenario, whether they are in a game that they're easily cruising to victory or in a game that's kind of a struggle fest, they can still pull out a victory. Now, does that mean that they're going to be able to do that against Ohio State? Not necessarily. And we're going to get to early thoughts on that game later on in the show. But I do think it shows that Indiana has the grit and the toughness to be able to pull out a big win like this because I can't stress enough. It doesn't matter how bad Michigan is this season. This was such a huge win for IU in so many levels. Only their second win over Michigan since 1987 and the first time that fans were able to see them get a victory over Michigan because the 2020 year, no one was there, which is just so unfortunate that people were, they're not able, we're not able to be at the game. That was the toughest thing for the 2020 season, is the Penn State game with Michael Penix's 2-point conversion. Imagine Memorial Stadium with tons of fans in the stadium seeing him get that 2-point conversion. There was no one there. The Michigan game, no one was able to see it in person. This is a completely different vibe. You're seeing Indiana when they blew out Nebraska, when they beat Washington, they beat Michigan. All of these home crowds showing that Indiana football, they have fans. They win, fans are going to come. And it's definitely making a whole lot of difference in Indiana's perceived perception. We got Jackson here saying, "What's up, Hoosier Nation?" Appreciate it, Jackson. We got Jeff as well saying, "I'm here tonight. Indiana 10-0 is so awesome." I still can't believe it. I still can't believe 10-0. We got Will and D as well saying, "Hey, Jeffrey, appreciate it, Will." And we got Sports Talk with Austin saying next week, Indiana Ohio State could be a top 5 showdown. It definitely could. I mean, it's right on the fringe of that. Even if it's just a top 10 showdown, I mean, still, that's just going to be a massive game. And what's so crazy is this, arguably you could say, is the biggest win in Indiana history over Michigan in this season, with all the perception and everything going on with Indiana possibly able to make the playoffs and the new 12-team playoff, everything going on with how bad Indiana's been for so long, and now they're 10-0. You could say this is the biggest one ever, and they have a shot to top it in the same season against Ohio State. That would be crazy. Absolutely. Then we got Jeff saying, "I think that Indiana could beat Ohio State if they have a flawless game." Absolutely. It's kind of like Indiana blowing out Nebraska 56-7 and then Ohio State beating them 21-17. If Indiana gets that version of Ohio State, where Ohio State barely beat Nebraska, and you get the version of Indiana that destroyed Nebraska, Indiana could beat Ohio State. But if you get this version of Indiana, the team that did struggle with Michigan, and then you get the Ohio State team that has looked really, really good outside of the game against Nebraska, and you could kind of argue that Penn State game, then I think Indiana could beat them. It definitely depends on how both teams play. But I do think that, unfortunately, the thing that's going to be working against Indiana is the fact that, yeah, Indiana is ranked in the top 10, so that's going to make Ohio State pay attention to Indiana. It's going to make them pay attention. They're not going to overlook the Hoosiers like they've done in years past, where Indiana is unranked and they're like 4-5 or whatever, and Indiana gave them a game. I mean, that's happened tons of times. That's happened a ton of times for Indiana football in the past, where they have snuck up on Ohio State in a game because of the fact that they weren't very good and no one was expecting them to give Ohio State a game. Well, now that Indiana's in the top 10, you know good and well Ryan Day is not going to let the Ohio State Buckeyes overlook Indiana. Now, I will say, though, something that not a lot of people are talking about: who does Ohio State play after this game? After they play Indiana, Ohio State has to play the Michigan Wolverines. And I know Michigan's having a significantly worse year, but there's still a chance of a look at it, because you know that Ohio State fans want to beat Michigan. They want to beat Michigan. I've seen Ohio State fans, whether they're just clowning around and they don't actually mean it, I have seen some Ohio State and Michigan fans say that they can lose every game in the season, as long as they beat their rival, then they're okay. Now, obviously, that's not true, because if Ohio State lost to Indiana and then beat Michigan, I don't think that they would still be super satisfied, because Ohio State fans want to win a championship this year. But it's still, the point is taken that Ohio State and Michigan fans loathe each other and they want to beat each other no matter what. And I think that makes a big difference when talking about this game right here, and the fact that there could be a look at it. Look at Nebraska. Underrated thing about that game where they got blown out by Indiana, their very next game was against Ohio State, and you could tell they gave it 110% against Ohio State. So I think Indiana plays better against Ohio State than they did against Michigan, because they know how big of a game this is. And I think Ohio State is going to give Indiana a way better game than they gave Nebraska. So I think you're going to see a better version of Ohio State than we have seen in some of their other games, and I think you're going to see maybe a better version of Indiana than you saw against Michigan, in my opinion. Troy V says 10-0 is enough reason for anyone to pay attention. The ranking is just a kicker. Absolutely. I agree with you, Troy V, and appreciate you for being here. I agree 110% on that, though. Absolutely. Because, you know, being 10-0 at least shows that you're a good team. It doesn't matter who you've played, right? You could play nobody opponents. You're still winning all your games, so you have to be at least good. The difference with Indiana, it's not like Liberty last year. Liberty, very impressive the season they had, but then they got absolutely destroyed, unfortunately for them, when they played Oregon in the bowl game, in the New Year's Six game. That was terrible. They clearly did not play tough enough opponents. to really gauge how good that they were. The difference with Indiana is that Indiana, their schedule's been a lot easier. A lot of people have made light of that. They're 100th in strength of schedule, and that definitely makes it where they're not that good. Still don't think that's fair, though, because Indiana's destroyed everybody that they have played outside of Michigan, and their strength of record is 6th in the nation, because based off their schedule and how much that they were favored to win by, games like UCLA where they were favored by 3 and won by 30, games like Michigan State where they were favored by 7, won by 37, games like Nebraska where they were favored by 7 and they ended up winning by 49. That makes your strength of record look good. So Indiana has the 6th best strength of record in college football. Only the 100th strength of schedule. That's going to go up when they play Ohio State, no matter the result. So I still think that with Indiana having that strength of record, the way that they have performed against their competition definitely has to make people think that, yes, this is a good football team. Sports Talk with Austin says Ohio State can sleepwalk because it's before Robert. Absolutely. I agree. Nobody's talking about I don't think that they will overlook Indiana in any way. There's no way that they could. There's just no way. If they do, then that's nuts because Indiana is in the top 10. They're not going to overlook them. But there is still that fact that they do play Michigan the very next week. And like I said, there is that psychological effect. We have seen in years past, Ohio State and Michigan, the week before they play each other, really struggle against their opponent, even a significantly worse opponent. So you never know. Jeff says Indiana could have beat Michigan on more, but the refs were calling us a bad play. Oh, the refs were terrible. So many missed holding calls. I mean, I don't like ever using that excuse. So many missed holding calls on Michigan. I mean, they held all game. And Indiana had a couple big drops. I mean, Elijah Surratt catches those 2 passes, completely different game. Indiana probably wins by 14 or 17. And if they win by 14 or 17, then people are saying, oh, well, Indiana did really good. There's still going to be detractors, though. I honestly don't care. What matters is that Indiana beat Michigan. Because if they didn't, then this game would mean a lot less here. And then people would have said Indiana's no good. Even if they lost to Michigan, it doesn't mean that they're no good, but that's what people would have said. Indiana has that perceived perception bias that you don't see with bigger programs like Ohio State or even my Crimson Tide. I love Alabama, but yes, Alabama's going to get favoritism. They lose to Vanderbilt, it's okay. Well, they beat Georgia, LSU, they're fine. They're still in the college football playoff race, and they should be. If they went out, Alabama absolutely should make the college football playoff. But we're going to get more into that in a minute because there is a lot of bias going against IU right now. But, I mean, early thoughts, like I said, on Indiana, Ohio State is I think this game being a noon game really helps the Hoosiers. I do. Unfortunately, Ohio State fans are livid that they keep getting all these noon games. But, unfortunately, that is the Fox contract obligation. Fox has the big noon kickoff game, and the reason that they do that is because of the fact that there's not that many other noon games that are anywhere near as good. A lot of the big games are at night. There's more competition for those time slots. So Fox has that big noon game. They put a really big game right out of the gate where everybody's going to watch, and there's not a lot of other great games on at the same time. So that's why it happens. But unfortunately, sucks for Ohio State because they would rather have a night game, and I wouldn't for Indiana. I think it helps out big time that this game is during the day. It's the same thing with Ohio State playing at Penn State. Penn State did lay an egg, especially on offense, yet again, while they couldn't knock off Ohio State. But what if the game was at night? It's a little bit different atmosphere at night. Things are rowdier, a little bit crazier. Doesn't mean that Ohio State still wouldn't have won. They probably still would have beaten Penn State, but you never know. Maybe things would have gotten a little bit more interesting if the game was at night at Penn State. I think if Ohio State was playing Indiana in the shoe at 7:30, I think Ohio State's chances to win go up even more. I think with this being a noon game, it gives Indiana more of a chance. It doesn't mean that it's a significantly more of a chance, but I do think that it gives Indiana a little bit more of a chance. And Indiana is an underdog by 9.5 right now. Ohio State's favored by 9.5, which has to be the lowest spread that Indiana's had against Ohio State in forever. Indiana being favored against Michigan for the first time since 1968 is crazy enough. But Indiana only being less than a 10-point underdog to Ohio State is wild. I mean, they usually are, 25 and 30-point underdogs. It's absolutely crazy. Sports Talk with Austin, do you expect more trick plays and more play calls you normally wouldn't see? Is the playbook going to be like, oh, yeah, I think Indiana's going to pull out a lot of crazy stuff, crazy material. Probably throw out all the stops. I mean, I don't know how crazy they'll get. Indiana hasn't done too many crazy things, but they've done reverses. They've done some flea flickers, stuff like that every now and then. But against Michigan, they didn't do it much. It was crazy. Like one play that Indiana has run a lot in previous games is the quarterback run where they look like they're going to run, and then Curtis Rourke, who's not known as a runner, keeps, and nobody's looking for it because he doesn't run much. Well, against Michigan, they ran it on the final play of the game. That mattered. Indiana picked up that first down with Curtis Rourke keeping it and getting the first, and no one was expecting it. No Michigan defender even looked in his direction. So maybe you'll see a couple plays like that where Rourke keeps. You don't want him getting hurt, but if Ohio State isn't expecting it and he can, break off for a 5-10 yard gain, that would help. But I do think you're going to see trick plays even from the Buckeyes. It's going to be a crazy game. I'm really looking forward to this game because of the fact this is probably the biggest game in Indiana history, at least in the modern era. Haven't beaten Ohio State since the 80s. If they beat Ohio State, they're in the playoff. They're in the playoff. You can still say they lose to Purdue, and you never know. Hangover, that would just be devastating. But if they beat Ohio State, they're in the playoff. If they lose to Ohio State, they have to lose close. They have to lose close. They need to lose by probably 14 or less. Bias against IU. And that'll be our next topic here. There is a lot of bias against Indiana right now when it comes to making the college football playoff. Will an 11-1 Indiana make the CFP? That's what everybody's talking about right now, because everybody is assuming that Indiana will lose to Ohio State, and I don't blame people for assuming that. They most likely will. They could win. I'm going to definitely point that out. They could beat Ohio State if they play their best game, but most likely Ohio State does win. But if Indiana keeps it close and then they beat Purdue, they won't make the Big Ten title game in that scenario. So 11-1. Will an 11-1 Indiana make the CFP? The funny thing about it is right now, according to the CFP predictor or whatever, Indiana has a 93% chance to make the playoff. So their chances are great. And that's probably most likely assuming they don't beat Ohio State. I'm sure the predictor is projecting that because they're an underdog. So since they're an underdog, they're going to project the loss. But they're still saying Indiana has a 93% chance to make the playoff. But I'm seeing more and more people start to throw around things that do not give me confidence when it comes to Indiana. Obviously, there it is, 10-0 the first time ever, which is so awesome. Do love the preseason polls mean nothing is what I wrote on Twitter earlier, because Indiana was picked to finish 17th in the Big Ten, which is hilarious. I definitely got that wrong. And then some Nebraska fans said that Indiana, are they cheating, which is hilarious. But this is the tweet I want people to see right here. They're trying to screw over Indiana, aren't they, is what I said. Because on ESPN, they said I would really hesitate to eliminate a 3-loss SEC team. Earlier on the Pat McAfee show, Heather Dinich, a person on ESPN, said that a 3-loss Georgia could still make the playoff. And when I'm looking at things like that, they have to be having Indiana in mind. They have to be having Indiana in mind, because you cannot say that Georgia gets in with 3 losses. Who are they going to be compared to? Who are they going to be compared to? Just say BYU ends up winning out and they win the Big 12. They're in. If Miami wins the ACC, they're in. This is all hypotheticals. But you're going to be coming down to at-large teams. Alabama, if they went out, they're going to make the playoff if they went out. You're going to have teams like Tennessee in there if they beat Georgia. Ole Miss could get in there. Penn State's going to be there. Notre Dame's going to be there. You're starting to run out of spots. Texas is there. So if it comes down to a 1-loss Indiana and a 3-loss Georgia, are you really going to put in a 3-loss Georgia over a 1-loss Indiana? I think that would be absolute garbage. I really do. I don't think that would be fair in the slightest, because I don't care that Indiana's strength of schedule is bad. I don't agree. I don't care. Michigan had a garbage schedule last year, didn't affect them in the rankings. Doesn't matter. Should that matter? If Indiana is competitive against Ohio State, as long as they are competitive against Ohio State and they lose, they should make the college football playoff, in my opinion. And yes, Austin, it is like Florida State all over again. I will never forget when they played Louisville in the ACC title game, and they were saying on the broadcast, if Florida State does not blow out Louisville, they're not getting in. And I understand why they ultimately left them out. I understand, because of the fact that if they had made the playoff without Jordan Travis, they would have gotten probably destroyed. They would have gotten blitzed. We saw what happened in the bowl game against Georgia last year. They got blitzed. So I understand it. But all that Florida State accomplished was for nothing. They went undefeated for nothing. And they still haven't gotten over it. Look at them this year. They're 1-9, which is insane. That's still one of the biggest drop-offs for a football program from one year to the next that I've ever seen. But You got Indiana, though. And what would be even crazier with a 12-team playoff and they're healthy, right? Like if Rourke, they're healthy, they got all their guys in, and then they somehow just don't put them in. They just don't put them in a 12-team playoff. Like, how can you put a Power 4 conference team with one loss and they don't get in? Honestly, I don't even know how you can do that. I really don't. I don't know how you can do that. This isn't a 4-team playoff anymore. If this is a 4-team playoff, at what everybody would be saying right now is Indiana has to win out. They have to win out. They can't lose. And then they would get in. And I'll be like, okay, that's fine. I get it. Absolutely. This is a 12-team playoff. The whole point of the 12-team playoff is to get more teams in the playoff. More money as well, right? So it just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense to even start suggesting that a 3-loss Georgia, especially a team in Georgia that just got destroyed by Ole Miss. They got destroyed. So, I don't know. I honestly I think it's crazy talk. I don't even think a 3-loss Alabama should get in. I don't think a 3-loss Alabama should get in either. I don't think really this year any 3-loss SEC team should get in. In some years in a 12-team playoff, maybe a 3-loss SEC team should get in. Not this season. Not this season. It doesn't make sense at all because of the fact, unfortunately, for the SEC, it looks a little bit weaker as a whole. I mean, LSU's not doing all that good right now. They just got destroyed by Alabama. And, I mean, Bama lost to Vandy. Georgia's not looking that great. I mean, imagine if Georgia had lost to Kentucky. They almost lost to Kentucky. But a win's a win. Then Indiana barely beats Michigan, and that don't count. But okay. Jeff says, I think Indiana should get in the CFP of the 11-1. Absolutely. We got Leo here. Appreciate you for stopping by. He says that, yes, they definitely need to be competitive. Cannot repeat a second half equivalent to Michigan. Oh, yeah. If they have that second half against Michigan at any point in the Ohio State game, they're going to get beat by a lot. They have to just fight, like Nebraska did. Out of fight. The Vols need to win. If Tennessee wins out, they're good to go. Keep chopping, says Sankey will start his propaganda sheet soon. Thank you for being here. Yeah, well, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. There's nothing you can do about it. I mean, don't get me wrong. I know the SEC is a great conference, and in the last 20 years, it's arguably been the best conference basically every season. And even this year, I would still say that the SEC is probably the best conference. I mean, the thing is 98% of the most talented players that come out of high school are in the South, right? They're in California. They're in Texas. They're in Florida. So how are you going to expect the SEC, to not be good? Plus, people in the South love football. I mean, people in the North do too, Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State, Oregon, Washington, whatever. But the South, more people love football as a whole. A&M, Texas, Bama, Auburn, Georgia, Florida, whatever, Tennessee. All of these pro games, they fill up their seats every week. The SEC has the fans. They got the players because, I mean, most of the great athletes in high school are in the South. So, yeah, the SEC's best league. It is. But this year, I mean, it's still the best league, but I don't think the Big Ten's that far behind. I don't think it's that far behind. But the thing is that if Indiana was Michigan, and nobody would be disagreeing with this right now. If Indiana had a 7-point loss state, they'd get in. All that would have to be different is that instead of it having Indiana on the helmet, it would just have to be Michigan. If Michigan was on the helmet and their only loss was to Ohio State by 7, and they had Indiana's schedule, the same schedule, they would get in automatically. But because it's IU, then the schedule matters. I don't think it should. In a 4-team playoff, yes, but not in a 12-team playoff. Indiana, doesn't matter. They don't have a brand. The thing is, they're building their brand. Have anybody seen the amount of interest that's increased with Indiana? They're selling out stadiums. The social media presence has gone through the roof. Like, people are following Indiana football more than they ever have. And they're doing everything they can to keep Cignetti right now. And we'll get to that in a minute before we wrap up the show. But, I mean, literally, Indiana, they're not a brand. But it's not like they're Wake Forest either. They're not Wake Forest. Jeff says, come on, no one would have thought Indiana would have been 10-0. That's what I'm saying. That's what cracks me up when all these people are like, Indiana's trash, they don't need to be there, whatever. People that say that thought they were going to go 3-9. I mean, I remember Nebraska fans saying they were going to beat Indiana by 50. Indiana beat them by 50. Now, if Indiana played Nebraska 10 times, would they beat them by 50 every time? No. But still, like, Indiana has outperformed expectations from everybody. And even still, I wasn't sure if they beat Michigan. I wasn't sure, but they did. So, keep chops as LSU really sucks. Yes, they do. Hummus Hero says, hey, Jeff, appreciate that. Yeah, Notre Dame, they do. If they went out, Notre Dame's in. Even with a crappy loss to Northern Illinois, they get in. Why? Because of the fact they beat everybody else. They beat everybody else. So if Notre Dame gets in with a loss to Northern Illinois and they won all their other games, then Indiana should be in with a loss to Ohio State and they won all their other games. I know Notre Dame beat A&M. I get that. Indiana doesn't have that caliber of a win. But still, Notre Dame lost to a really bad team. Now, that doesn't make Notre Dame a bad team. Me and Will have talked about tons of time. Will's team is good. Notre Dame is good. They are a good team this year. They still shouldn't have lost to Northern Illinois. That was ridiculous. But they did. But still, you know. Keith Chops says Ohio State be number one if they had IU schedule. Well, most teams that are really good, if they had Indiana's schedule, would be undefeated right now as well, and they would probably be ranked number one. Alabama would be ranked number one. Ohio State would be ranked number one. So, 100%. Hummus Hero says it's not 98% of the talent. There are blue chippers all over Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, New Jersey, and the DC. I know, Hummus. I get it, but you know what I know? I mean, Florida is sick. Florida is sick. They have so many athletes in Florida. And that's why the Florida schools used to be so great. Florida, Florida State, Miami. The reason that those teams aren't as good all the time anymore is because they don't keep those guys in state. Those guys are going to Bama and Georgia and LSU. They're not staying in the state of Florida. I know what you mean, though. Yeah, there are really good players in the Midwest. But if you look at talent aggregation in the country, the vast majority, at least 70%, of the greatest high school players are in the South. That's all I mean. That's all I'm saying. There are talented players in the Midwest. And the only reason Indiana hasn't really been able to recruit is because they never invested in football. They never invested in football, and teams like Notre Dame and Ohio State, they took all the players. Yeah, there are talented players in the state of Indiana and the state of Michigan, Ohio. There are. There just aren't as many. But I do agree with you. You're not wrong. You were absolutely correct, Thomas. There are talented players everywhere. I mean, you can find a great player from Idaho, I'm sure, every now and then. It's like never, hardly, but it can happen. Yeah, 70-30, 100%, 70-30. But see, that makes a difference, though. Because if so many of those guys are staying in the South, that makes the SEC disproportionately more talented. If it's a 70-30 difference. Especially when in the North, think about it. In the South, you've got brand programs like Florida, Florida State, Miami, Tennessee, Auburn, Alabama, Georgia, LSU, Texas A&M, Texas. It goes on and on. In the North, you've got Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State. There's not much else. There's not a lot of other brands. You got Wisconsin, you've got Iowa, but those aren't big brands. They're good, but they're not big brands. So yeah, the SEC just does have a disproportionate advantage. It's not an unbeatable advantage, but there's a reason the SEC has won like 18 of the last 22 national championships. Sports Talk with Austin said, what if it comes down to one loss Miami to one loss Indiana? Well, that's not going to matter, Austin, because a one-loss Miami is going to get in because that means they would win out and win the ACC. They already have one loss. So if they win out, they're going to win the ACC. So that's not going to matter. Well, it would matter more if it's a two-loss Miami and a one-loss Indiana. In that case, it should be the one-loss Indiana, because if it's a two-loss Miami, it means they lost in the ACC title game. I mean, if it's a really close loss to like Clemson or SMU or whatever, but they lost to Georgia Tech. I mean, it's not a great loss. Barely beat Virginia Tech and Cal. Indiana's blown everybody out. Miami has barely beat garbage teams. No offense. I mean, Virginia Tech's not garbage, but come on. I mean, still, Miami, if they're really good, would beat them by more. Michigan's a better team than Virginia Tech. So, especially talent-wise. Their quarterback play, Michigan's just horrible. But as a team, Michigan's still better than Virginia Tech. Miami's not been that impressive. I mean, Miami's played tougher teams than Indiana has, yes, but it's not that significant. It's not that significant. Thomas says in Indiana to pull guys away from Ohio State, Notre Dame to get it locally, that's a struggle. Yeah, 100%. I mean, and Indiana's never invested. They always had that basketball team. Scott Dolson, the athletic director in Indiana, realizes that Indiana has to be good in football or they're going to get kicked out of the Big Ten. That's what they knew right there. And there it is. Should an 11-1 Indiana make the CFP? It's been a raging debate on Twitter today since I posted this. 83% of people say yes, and 16% of people say no. So most people are saying that Indiana should get in. There are some detractors, a lot of votes too, almost 400 votes. But most people are saying that they should get in. Less so than the CFP predictor saying right now, but still a lot. But definitely the thing that is helping Indiana, though, is that Indiana's NIL is getting better. Because you're talking about that hummus hero about they have to compete for all these players in these other schools. Well, the NIL is getting better. They have been posting all day, asking Hoosier fans to donate. I don't know how much money they've made. I don't know how much money they have made at all with NIL, but they're trying to keep Cignetti. I mean, there's literally been posts saying that, like, this is trying to keep Cignetti. So they want to keep Cignetti. They want to keep the assistants. It already looks like Indiana's defensive coordinator, Brian Haynes, is on list for, like, Temple. Please don't go to Temple. Like, Indiana needs him to stay for a couple more years to keep this thing rolling. They got to build up Indiana into a really good team, or if this is just a one-year deal, it's all going to fall apart. Like, recruits are actually looking at IU, but it's because of these coaches. If they leave, it's all going to tank. But Indiana's NIL is getting better. And with that fact, it could help Cignetti stay, the coordinator stay, and maybe it can make Indiana not be a force, but a really solid program for years to come. Even if they're just like a Wisconsin, that would be really good for IU. From where they've been to be on the Wisconsin level every year, an 8-4 team, that would be crazy. Keep chopping. There's so much talent in Florida that every college, every level in the state lost last weekend. Yeah, that's hilarious. It's still, though, a lot of those Florida schools are having a hard time keeping those guys in state. Leo says, where do you think Indiana lands tonight in the CFP rankings? I say 6th. The AP poll, they're 5th. They're 5th in the AP poll. I think they move up to 6th. If they're any less than that, though, if they're at 7th, or if they remain at 8th, then yeah, that means that Indiana, if they lose to Ohio State, no matter how much they lose by, they're probably not going to let them in. But I think they're going to move them up to 6th. We'll see. If they're any less than 6th, then that's an outrage. That's ridiculous. They should be 6th. But we'll see. I think if they are 6th or 5th, but probably 6th, then I think that means that Indiana is in really good shape no matter what happens in that Ohio State game. Besides a blowout, as long as it's competitive, then I think that Indiana will get in. But if they're 7th or lower, then that means that Ohio State loss could bump them down to like 12 or 13, and then that's going to put them on the outside looking in. Because you got to remember, being ranked 12th isn't enough. You have to be 11 or higher because of that. You have the Group of 5 champion, right? Boise State's going to get that 12 seed, unless somehow they're ranked higher than the Big 12 champion, which would be crazy. So I don't know. Hummus Hero says Indiana and Miami will end up with similar strength of schedule, I think. Yeah, and of course, Miami's still probably going to get that advantage because it's Miami, and that's unfair. Yeah, Miami's strength of schedule is terrible. Indiana's is terrible. It is. But Indiana's look better than Miami. I mean, they keep calling them the Cardiac Canes for a reason. They're barely beating teams. And Cam Ward is basically carrying the team on his back. So, I mean, yeah, it's impressive or whatever, but still not all that good. Whereas Indiana's been a complete team. Their defense has been great. Their offense has been great all across the board. And, yeah, they had a struggle today. Or not today, but this week. But Michigan, literally, though, is still a better team than, like, basically everybody Miami's played. I mean, yeah, Miami beat Florida, but Florida was really bad in week 1. They've gotten a little better with Lagway, but now they're falling apart again because he got injured. But still, like, Miami's just not that impressive. Thomas Hero said, in the new age of the sport, anyone with the cash can compete. It's all about coaches, facility, and coordinating the players. Absolutely. And sadly, the money, it talks. And if you don't have it, you're not going to win. And it sucks because I think that the sport's going in the wrong direction. We've talked about this at length, and I could talk about this for 5 hours. But I do think that the sport's going in the wrong direction. Realignment, the portal, the fact that the Big 12 and the ACC are basically almost irrelevant now, and that the Big 10 and the SEC control everything, and they have most of the best teams, it's bad. A lot of it is not great. A lot of it is not great. But unfortunately, that it's the nature of the game. these days. If you don't have money, you're not going to win. And if you win for brief, it's not going to last. And this is what IU is going through right now. They're having the magical season, but if they don't pay Signetti, they don't use NIL that they're getting from the alumni base, which Indiana is one of the highest alumni base in the country. Tons of rich donors. If they don't support this football team, then Indiana is going to go back to being garbage. They have to show that they want to win. And that's the way it works. That's why it's hilarious when people are like, oh, well, this coach bought this team. This guy bought. Yeah, they're all doing it now. In the past, only a few programs and coaches were doing it. And sometimes they would get in trouble. Sometimes. Not all of them would. But now everybody's doing it. It's the rules. The rules are that you can basically buy your team. Ohio State did it this year. They wouldn't have had Will Howard and Quinshon Judkins and all those guys, Caleb Downs and all those players without paying for them. So that's what Indiana's got to do. They're not going to get players that good, but if they can get some really good players, I think that Indiana has a shot, but they have to support the team. Sports Hall of this is like Louisville from last year, if you think about it. Yeah, it is. I mean, technically not wrong. I mean, Louisville's schedule last year was bad. It was really bad. And they got exposed at the end. They did. They got exposed at the end. The Kentucky game, the Florida State game. I mean, Louisville should have won the ACC last year, man, the title game. I mean, you're playing Florida State, and Florida State has their backup, like, third-string quarterback in, and they look like garbage, and Louisville still lost. I mean, I'm like, Louisville should have won. So the thing is honestly, I think Indiana this year is better than Louisville that year, but it's pretty similar. It is pretty similar. I'm not going to lie. It is pretty similar. And the thing is, though, is look at Louisville this year. Louisville's still decent. That's what Indiana needs to do this year. They need to be, even with a tougher schedule. Louisville is a tougher schedule this year, but they're still decent. They're still ranked. They're still doing all right. It is the ACC, though. But, I mean, if Indiana next year goes 5-7, then this is just TCU all over again. Everybody is comparing it to that already. I don't think it is. I don't think they are TCU 2022, but they're going to have to figure out how to make sure that they keep most of these coaches around, or it could be. As a lot of people forget, a big reason why TCU dropped off is because Garrett Riley, the offensive coordinator at TCU, went to Clemson. And that didn't help TCU at all. That did not help at all. Hamas Hero said, yeah, there's a scenario where Boise gets the 4th seed and the Big 12 champ isn't. Yeah, that could happen. If that happens, that would be crazy. That would just be a smack in the face to the rules. Because the group of 5 supposed to get the 12th spot. That would just make the Big 12 look terrible. Honestly. Jack says, tell your friends, family, cashers, posts about the magic Jeffrey brings Hoosiers live every Tuesday night. Appreciate it, Jackson, a lot. Appreciate it. And Leo says, so basically all we need is to send donations to IU Sport. I'm not sure how that works. Yeah, a lot of programs are doing it. I know Indiana's been having it all day with Hoosiers Connect, where you donate and to help the team. It's been going on all day. So definitely, I think that, I think it's going to help Indiana with the amount of support that they've been getting this season from fans, and more fan interest is going Indiana football's way. I think that can only help the team and give them a better chance to succeed in this modern day of college football. You have to have NIL. You got to have money to win, unfortunately. Jackson said, don't forget to tell the cashers and posts about the magic that Jeffrey creates. I only talk sports and on Alabama College every Tuesday night. Appreciate it, Jackson. Absolutely. If you guys are liking the show, like the stream down below. Subscribe to the channel if you are new, whether you're watching on the Big Ten or the Indiana channel. Would really appreciate it. Trying to build up the subs here. And also, check out my YouTube channel, Only Talk Sports. I'm sure you guys have seen it before, but if you haven't subscribed yet, would really appreciate it if you do. I talk college football, college basketball, NFL, and NBA every single day. And the Alabama Collins Show with Jackson every Thursday night at 10 o'clock. Where Alabama fans or even non-Alabama fans can talk about the Crimson Tide or the state of college football at large. Always a blast. Hummus Hero as well saying Ohio State got 4 or 5 guys in the portal that cost some cash. I had to pay the guys they already had. Yeah, absolutely. Like, that's the thing with Clemson. I've been saying it forever with Clemson. If Dabo Swinney would just get 4 or 5 players in the portal that are really good, to add on to the players he already has, Clemson would be just fine. But he's not doing it. And I understand why he's not doing it. He's stubborn because he believes in his principles. And I understand why he believes in his principles. He wants to recruit guys for 2 or 3 years that he knows would fit his program, that, that they're good guys on and off the field. I love that he's sticking to his guns. But the problem is that him doing that is making Clemson not win as much. They're not as good, and that's just a fact. They're not as good. So, Ohio State, they have a lot of NIL. They got tons of NIL, and they recruit the high school ranks like crazy, and then they fill those gaps. They fill those gaps with a few portal guys. And that's what Indiana's going to have to do. Indiana's got to up their high school recruiting game and then get a few portal guys. Because, yeah, Indiana brought in a ton of portal guys this year. That's not sustainable. That's not going to work every year. Look at Florida State. It worked in 2022, 2023. It did not work this year. So if Indiana follows that method, it's not going to always work. So I think that's definitely the key. You got to have great high school recruiting and then fill your gaps in the portal. Yeah, Riley didn't help Clemson. He didn't. But he was good at TCU that year. Absolutely was. And ever since he's left, TCU hasn't looked the same. I mean, they're all right this year, but way worse. But yeah, he has kind of underperformed at Clemson, not going to lie. Jack says, I feel like if Indiana was in the Big 12 ACC team, I think they would get left out because who's in the Big 10? Yes, they're in the Big 10. Come on. I mean, the SEC and the Big 10, it's all the bias, right? All the bias. If that's the case, then now you should get in at 11-1. They're not in the Big 12 of the ACC. I mean, they gotta put them in. A close loss to Ohio State, you gotta put them in. Now, if they lose to Purdue too, they're done. Get them out. I mean, man, I hope they don't lose to Purdue. I mean, I would just be sad if they somehow beat Ohio State and then lost to Purdue. Oh man, the spoiler makers. Ugh. Purdue's really bad this year. That cannot happen. But I've seen weird things in football. Notre Dame beat A&M, lose to Northern Illinois. Bama beat Georgia, lose to Vandy. It can happen. So just don't want that to happen. I'd rather them barely lose to Ohio State and beat Purdue, make the playoff, than them beat Ohio State and then lose to Purdue. Honestly, I probably would prefer that. I probably would. Because, I mean, if they lost to Purdue, how far would they even drop? I mean, you would think they'd probably still make the playoff. You think they would? I mean, I really do want them to beat Ohio State, but you can't lose to Purdue. You can't lose to Purdue. Not this year. Purdue is horrible. They're really bad. So just Indiana, be competitive against the Buckeyes and beat Purdue, and they should get in. If they don't, that's crazy. That's just wrong. Sports Talk with Austin says, I don't like the show after you talk bad about Carl laughing. I love having fun. You got my vote. No, you're good, Austin. I know. Louisville wasn't bad. They weren't bad. They weren't bad at all. They just – it's tough when you aren't a brand team. Louisville's not a brand team. Indiana's not a brand team, and they're going to get biased against them, and especially when you have an easier schedule. I mean, like Louisville, I think more people respect Louisville this year for beating Clemson than what they did last year. And you would probably agree with that, Austin. Like, people are probably more impressed with Louisville this year, even though they have no shot at the playoff, none of that stuff, no shot at winning the ACC. But they beat Clemson. Versus last year, they basically beat nobody and had a great record. I'm actually probably more impressed with Louisville this year, to be honest. I mean, the only reason I'm so impressed with Indiana is that Indiana's never this good, ever. Like, Louisville's had success in the past. They had a Heisman-winning quarterback in Lamar. Indiana's had nothing. Penix for brief, and that's it. They've had nothing. So, definitely, Indiana's way worse than Louisville. It's so shocking to see this season. No, not Kirsten any worse. I don't see Indiana losing to Purdue, although that game could either go on Peacock or Fox. But, man, don't be on Peacock. Please just put it on the Big Ten Network. I want to be able to watch it. Now, they already put the Michigan State game on Peacock. Yeah, I agree. I don't think they lose. I don't think they lose to Purdue either. I mean, Signetti, he's going to make them, no matter what happens in an Ohio State game, treat Purdue like an opponent. It's a rivalry game. I don't think so. Plus, Indiana hasn't beaten Purdue in football in like 5 years, so it's a big deal. Sports Hall Doll said, yeah, the ACC's bad. It's not that bad. I think Miami could beat Penn State. ACC as a whole is pretty bad. The problem is that their teams at the top, like Miami or Clemson, aren't good enough to, and Florida State being really bad this year drags the conference down. Yeah, Miami could beat Penn State or Indiana, but I mean, honestly, Miami could probably hang with most teams this year, but still, I mean, the ACC is a significantly worse comp. They're not even near the Big Ten or the SEC as a whole. Not even close. Not even close. But they're not horrible. They're just not very good. Thomas said, I think the SEC is deeper than the Big Ten, but I see the committee likely giving equal bids. Yeah, 100%. 100%. SEC's deeper than the Big Ten. They got more good teams, but the Big Ten at the top is pretty good. I mean, Oregon, Ohio State, Penn State. I mean, Penn State's not great, but still, Penn State's not bad. Jackson says, in all seriousness, if Indiana does beat Ohio State, basically in the playoff, Purdue, the game's just icing on the cake. As long as they beat Ohio State, Purdue, like you beat Ohio State, you don't lose to Purdue, and then you make Big Ten title game, then yeah, no matter what happens, if they beat Oregon or lose Oregon, if they beat Oregon, they might even be ranked number 1, which would be insane. But if they lose to Oregon, they'd be in anyway. Hummus says I could see SEC 4, Big Ten 3, but I can't see 5 and 3. No, I mean if the SEC gets 5 teams in, that's just ridiculous. I mean there is a log jam at the top, you never know, but that would just be crazy. I could see 4 and 3. I mean the Big Ten, you're gonna have Oregon, you're gonna have Ohio State most likely, and then probably Indiana or Penn State. You could get 4 in the Big Ten, not likely, but you could maybe. Possible. Jackson, but no one today wants to get Indiana the first conference title since 67. That top 4 receiver they get about. Yeah, Cignetti is a fantastic coach. I just hope it continues. I hope he stays at IU. I hope he can somehow get Indiana that went over Ohio State for the first time since the 80s. It's going to be crazy. But I will say that Indiana is doing a great job with NIL. They're up in that game. And even though people have all this bias against them, trying to say Georgia should get in with 3 losses over Indiana, I don't think it's going to happen. I hope it doesn't happen, and it definitely shouldn't happen. But thanks, everybody, for being here tonight. Like the stream down below. Subscribe to the channel if you are new. Share the stream out on social media. Thank you, Austin, Jackson, Hummus Hero, Jeff, all you guys for being here. Troy V, really appreciate it. Keep chopping. And definitely hope to see you guys next Tuesday at 7 o'clock to really preview that Ohio State game. I had a few thoughts on it tonight, but definitely going to be previewing that game next week. It's going to be a lot of fun. Definitely thanks for being everybody. Indiana's 10-0 and just bask in it for a week. Don't even think about Ohio State. Your IU Hoosiers are 10-0, folks. Thanks for being here, everybody. Go Hoosiers.